Hi everyone and welcome back to Not Weave Stitch. My name is Gisela and this week I wanted to dive into needle felting. So what is needle felting? It's a craft where you use a specialised needle with barbs on the end of it to repeatedly stab into some wool. And when you do the stabbing motion into the wool, it basically interlocks the fibres together to mesh them and to make them form into a shape. So the fibres in the wool basically catch onto the barbs, and when the fibres catch onto the barbs, as you're doing the stabbing motion into the wool, they basically tangle and mesh up together. And the more you stab into the wool, it becomes a much more solid structure. For myself, I find it such a therapeutic craft, very mindful. I very much use it to relax and to not worry about things when you're just constantly doing that stabbing motion. It is a great stress relief. It's one of the crafts that I actually did a lot of in the lockdowns, and I found it very therapeutic. I couldn't really think of much else except for that kind of stabbing motion and beginning to form a shape out of wool, which I thought was just incredible. Just with a needle, you can form all sorts of shapes. With needle felting, you can make all sorts of different things. So I have seen and made jewellery. You can make necklaces, bracelets, earrings. You can make felted bags. You can do decorations. I've done lots of Christmas decorations out of needle felting. Garlands as well, lovely garlands that you can do for all occasions. I've made felted wreaths. With those things, you have to be careful if you're popping it outside, but I usually like to hang my wreaths up inside the house. So I'll have one for each occasion. So Easter, Halloween, Christmas, there's always a needle felted wreath hanging up somewhere. You can also make 3D structures, and that looks into armature. So armature is basically using wires as a base, as a structure, basically like the bones of your piece. And then you would needle felt your wool around this wire structure to make your project. So I've done it before with a big needle felt fox, where I was using wires for the kind of bare bones, and then I would needle felt my wool around that to make my lovely little fox. You can make needle felt pins to pop on bags, needle felt brooches, pieces to pop onto a hat or a hairband. There are so many uses for it. And I find that with needle felting, it's kind of gone out of fashion. I'm trying to bring it back there, and I really encourage people to take a look at it because it is a super simple craft to get started with. And I don't think it's too expensive when you're just using kind of the base materials there to get yourself started. It is not expensive, anywhere near as expensive as lots of other crafts are. So I would definitely recommend having a look at needle felting if you haven't already done so. But felting itself dates back thousands of years. It's definitely an ancient craft and art form there. It's actually one of the oldest textile arts. But in terms of needle felting specifically, that's much more of a modern craft and art form. So it was more recently developed into needle felting in the 20th century and much more for a art and craft purpose rather than kind of functional. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, they started to develop needle felting with the specialised barb needles being manufactured. And then moving on to the 1970s and the 1980s, it really started to kick off in Europe and particularly in Germany. So I'm part German, and that's where I first saw my needle felting. My mum had quite a lot of needle felt craft books, particularly needle felt jewellery with the kind of roving wool balls there for necklaces and bracelets. So that's when I think I first saw needle felting as a craft form. And then after the 1980s, the technique really grew in popularity, particularly because of the accessibility of materials and its low cost as well, made it a really popular craft form around the world. So you're probably thinking, what do I need to get started? Not much actually. So like I said before, It's a relatively low cost craft to get started with, and you don't really need much to start as a beginner. But the three main things that I would recommend to get started in needle felting is a needle felt needle. You can't use a regular needle because it's too smooth. You need a specific needle felt needle which has barbs on the end of it, and you can get them anywhere. Lots of craft shops or online do needle felt needles because you need those specific barbs to be able to mesh your fibres. You will also need the wool itself. There is a whole range of different wools and different types of wools that you can use. The most common one is something called roving wool, and that's the one that you usually see in shops and online. So you will need wool, particularly roving wool can be a good starting point for a beginner, so that you've got something to stab your needle into to be able to mesh those fibres together into a shape. And lastly, I would recommend some form of a base. So when you are stabbing into the wool, you need something underneath to be able to not only hold the wool into place, but also something to protect your needle. Because otherwise, with that stabbing motion, if you're doing it straight onto your table, you're going to end up breaking the tip of your needle with the contact between the needle and the table. So I would recommend some sort of base. And you can get lots of different types of bases. So I myself like to work in between different things. So you can get something called a brush mat, which is basically like a little block that has lots of bristles into it, which you would then pop your wool on top of. And then when you are needle felting, that stabbing motion would allow the needle to go into those bristles and it won't smack onto your table. So those bristles really do protect the barbed needle there from snapping. You could also use some sort of cushion. So I have a needle felt specific cushion, which is really nice and soft, and it's also a larger surface area as well. So I pop my wool on top of that, and then when I am needle felting, the needle itself will go straight into the cushion. And I've also used little blocks of polystyrene. Again, that can be quite cheap if you've got any offcuts or if you've got any maybe left over from a package that may have been sent to you. Little polystyrene blocks can be really great for that. The only thing is with the polystyrene, the more you use it, it starts to kind of chip off the little pieces there, which might end up in your needle felting itself. So it's great to get started with, but in the long term there, you want maybe something that's a bit more durable, like a brush mat or a cushion. But there's lots of different bases that you can use. Everyone has their own personal preferences, but those are the three main types that I've used and the three main types that I usually kind of see people using online. Another thing is safety. It is amazing how many times you can easily catch your fingers. And it really does hurt, particularly with the barbs on the end of the needles. So it's something to be careful of. If you are very clumsy, like I am, I would recommend things like thimbles or finger guards just to protect them, because it is so common when you are felting away to accidentally stab your fingers there. So I would really recommend looking at that just to protect yourself. If not, it's trying to keep your fingers really out of the way, but as you are kind of getting into the zone, it can be so easy to catch your fingers. So thimbles or finger guards can be really helpful. So those are the three main things that you would need to get started. But obviously there are loads more materials and kit that you can use. Again, something I will be talking more in detail in future episodes. But those three things, so a base, a needle felt needle, and some wool are the three main things that you need to get started with. And like I said, it's that stabbing motion that meshes those fibres together. The fibres catch on the barbs and they begin to interlock to really build up your design. So if you haven't already, I would highly recommend taking a look at needle felting. It's far more therapeutic than you may think. So have a look and let me know if you get started on any projects and how you get on with them. So in next week's episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into needle felting. So I will go into far more detail about the types of needles, so the other gauges and the other types of needles that you can get. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different types of wool and what may be best for your project. I'll also be talking a little bit more about the other kit that you can get, the other equipment that you can get for needle felting that you might find useful. I'll also be talking more about tips and tricks with needle felting, how to get you started and how to do the best practice with your felting to get a really nice smooth finish. If you can, please subscribe to my podcast. I would be so grateful. Additionally, I have a Patreon with different tiered memberships, so please do consider joining the Knot Weave Stitch community, as it really helps keep the podcast alive. I also have an accompanying podcast blog on my website, which is www.giselanartin.com, which follows each episode, so feel free to take a little look at that. As ever, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you again in the next one.